Hello and welcome to the Sidebar presented by True Crime News, taking you inside the courtrooms of high-profile and notorious cases from across the country. I'm your host, Joshua Ritter. I'm a criminal defense lawyer based in Los Angeles and previously an LA County prosecutor for nearly a decade. You can find me on all social media at Joshua Ritter ESQ or at joshuaritter.com. We're recording this on Friday, June 14th, 2024. In this week's episode, a former police officer convicted for the kidnapping and murder of a 16-year-old girl, plus a father sentenced to jail time after pleading guilty to drugging his daughter's friends with sedatives during a sleepover. But first, high drama in the RICO prosecution of Young Thug as the rapper's defense attorney is held in contempt of court. Today, we are very happy to be joined by Jack Rice, a former prosecutor, criminal defense attorney, law teacher, and legal analyst you can find on Court TV and many other outlets. Jack, welcome back.
It's great to be with you as always. Why is this taking so long?
I don't know. I have no idea, but it doesn't happen often enough. And I got to let everybody know, too, that as sometimes happens, we had some scheduling issues come up this morning, and I thought to myself, who can fill in quickly and think on their feet and follows all these cases? And I called up Jack, and he said, let me throw on a tie and open up my laptop, and I'm ready to go. And so, as always, the consummate professional, thank you again, sir. We appreciate you being here.
Well, if nothing else, I have to tell you, and this is the truth, is that you get this like I do. We're trial lawyers. And the thing about trial lawyers is maybe the strongest, most important skill set that we have is we have to be nimble. We have to be able to sort of move on our feet. And sometimes it's based upon the information that we have or what we can just sort of pull from the ether around us. So it's just what we do. So I'm thrilled. I mean, we're buddies. So I'm happy to be on with you.
Well, great, especially with a background as a prosecutor. Most of that practice is just shooting from the hip. When I started to move out of prosecution and got into defense and a little more of civil work, it's amazing how much everybody wants time to prepare and where's my brief and how are we going to argue it? Whereas in the prosecutor's office, it's always just like, yeah, I'll just argue that thing in court. Let's just head down to court and bring it up in front of the judge. So with that skill set, please employ all of your powers this morning. But I know that we chat about these cases a little bit and you're familiar with them. And I really enjoy hearing your take on these things. And so the first one, moving to Atlanta, Georgia, where the RICO case facing a Grammy award-winning rapper continues with a dramatic flair as the longest trial in Georgia's history drags on. Recording artist Young Thug, born Jeffrey Williams, faces 9 felony charges for possession of drugs and weapons, participation in a criminal street gang, and conspiracy to violate Georgia's racketeering laws, with prosecutors arguing Williams and his recording collective YSL operated as a criminal organization. The difficult prosecution, which has seen numerous delays after a nearly year-long jury selection process, hit yet another snag when their star witness, alleged YSL associate Kenneth Little Woody Copeland, refused to take the stand and had to be jailed before eventually agreeing to testify. This reversal from Copeland caused defense attorney Brian Steele to accuse prosecutors of coercing the witness, intimating that the state had held a private meeting with the judge and Copeland, threatening to keep the man in jail until the trial's conclusion if he failed to testify. The judge questioned where Steele received this information of the meeting, which was not disclosed to the defense, though a court reporter was present, and held Steele in criminal contempt, when he failed to disclose his source. Steele was then sentenced to 20 weekend days in jail. However, the Georgia Supreme Court stayed enforcement of the sentence while they considered his appeal. While the trial has an uncertain future, we will continue to update you as the high-profile proceedings dramatically unfold. Jack, this has got a lot of people, especially attorneys, really hot under the collar in response to how the judge handled this entire situation. I'm just going to let you jump in and give your thoughts on, have you ever seen something like this before? Were you surprised? What are your thoughts?
I'm outraged. Truly, I'm outraged by this. And in fact, I can tell you, I'm on the board of directors of the Minnesota Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. I'm based in St. Paul, Minnesota. But we have the board from Wisconsin is the same. I know they're outraged by this very same thing. Let's talk about why this is as bad as it is.
Yeah.
Anytime you have a witness, meeting with the judge, with the prosecution, and they have a court reporter there, I would argue that's ex parte communication. This is outside of the context of the defense team being there. And that is extraordinary to me, because what it does is it brings up this question of not just fairness, but transparency. Because one of the things that's really important when it comes to any criminal case, frankly, any legal proceeding, is that people all buy in, that people are saying this is a fair, consistent, transparent process, and it applies to all of us. I mean, one of the things and one of the reasons I think about this so much is, as you mentioned at the beginning, and I appreciate the titles, but I got no titles, man. I'm just me. But I've taught trial advocacy and rule of law all over the planet. I'm going to be in Stockholm in a couple of weeks, and I'm giving a speech there. And one of the things that we talk about is this rule of law idea. And what it means is that everybody in the system buys in. And what happens if you don't buy in is when you start to see a fragmented system. Because I got to tell you, one of the very few things that we see on the planet where systems work, where countries work, is when everybody buys into the legal system. And I'm going way off topic, but I will come back, is that, so for instance, I'm also a former CIA case officer. Now, I bring it up for this reason. When the Soviet Union blew apart, one of the things that the intelligence community and the US government as a whole did is they rolled into parts of the Soviet Union and other parts of the world with the idea of trying to rebuild their legal systems because they wanted stability. And what happens, because people weren't buying in because it wasn't fair. And so it was critically important from the US government perspective. Now let's race back to the Young Thug trial in Georgia. All of a sudden, what you now have is a witness who is meeting with the prosecutor and the judge without, and specifically without, the defense attorney present. This, by its definition, is ex parte. Because what it does is it makes the judge look like they've chosen a side.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, this is that rule of law piece that I've been talking about in Ukraine, which is what we were concerned about worldwide, when you didn't have a system that was fair, that wasn't appropriate, that didn't work, because people break to pieces and they won't buy into it. What we have in Georgia right now in this particular trial is that perception. And so what you got from Brian Steele, the attorney, the defense attorney, was he lost his mind. Yeah. And it was magnificent, because what he did was he did not stop. He bit back in the way that any good defense attorney at their best should do. This judge was wrong, and he made sure he knew it, and he wasn't letting go. He was a junkyard dog. And I thought it was a magnificent thing. By the way, one last piece of it that I loved even more, when the judge held him in contempt and the judge said, take him, here's what he did. Took off his tie, took off his coat, handed it to his colleagues. He walked up to the bench, he walked up to the lectern, and he made sure he voiced his opposition to this. He made his objection to it. But then he did one thing that I loved more than anything else. He said, house me with my client, because we have a trial to prepare for. I thought, badass. I love that so much. I thought, if there's an award that I can give to this guy, I'm going to find it, because that was magnificent. And defense attorneys, and I would argue good prosecutors and good judges, should all come down and simply say, you don't do certain things, then the rule of law matters, and transparency matters, and fairness matters. And if we're all going to buy in, then we all have to believe that the system works. It failed that day.
Yeah.
How's that?
Yeah. That's fantastic. And I agree with you. The part that had a lot of criminal attorneys, especially, having him solidified as a hero in their books was what you just described. When he started just taking off his jacket and taking off his tie, he's not going to fight it. He's not going to cause a scene. This is what you feel you need to do, Judge? Fine. Here we go. Take me in. And then, but you're right. The part that I think absolutely may have even shamed the judge was when he said, I want to be housed with my client because I'm not going to allow this little circus you just put on to prevent me from continuing to zealously advocate on behalf of my client. It was really remarkable. It was like something to see out of a movie. It was fantastic. But
I'm so thrilled you feel the same way. I mean, I respect you very much. And what you're saying is what I would really wish for right now, though, is I really do believe that I would like to see prosecutors, DAs stepping into this space, because the thing is that some people imagine that this is a horse race, that somehow it's sort of them versus us. And it feels that way to us sometimes too. And in defense bar, but certainly as prosecutors too. And as a former prosecutor, it sort of feels like an us and them thing. And it does to judges. I get that too. But at the same time, we are all part of a system that must work. And when you fail in a system, when a system in itself fails, you can't just have the one side that's being treated inappropriately being the one screaming. It has to be everybody if you need the system to work. And that's why I'm a little frustrated that I'm not hearing DAs across the country and judges across the country saying, you screwed up. You did something wrong here.
I completely agree with you. And I want to get into that a little bit more because the DA did at one point stand up and say, maybe we should all take a breath on this whole thing. And before the judge makes this ruling, maybe we should have a hearing, what have you. But there's bigger concerns about saving this case that the prosecutor should have had. But before we get to that, though, just so listeners understand, too, the judge, this was incredible, completely flipped the script on what this was about, because it was about this ex-parte meeting that you talked about and the indignation that the defense attorneys had that there was a meeting that apparently coerced a witness and they were not told about it, provided with the transcript, or allowed to be present. But the judge immediately spun it into, how'd you find out about this? If you don't tell me how you found out about this, that's why he was found in contempt for not giving up his source. And the attorney said, I've got a privilege here. I've got attorney-client privilege. I've got work product privilege. And quite frankly, I'm just not going to be compelled to tell you something. And that's where he really dug in. And I wanted you to kind of flesh that out, because this wasn't just some sort of, the attorney's losing his mind and he was behaving inappropriately. He was being put into jail because he wouldn't dime somebody out. And that's what the judge was most frustrated about. Not that the fact that he had an inappropriate meeting, or not to explain why that meeting took place if there was an appropriate reason, but you won't tell me who told on me.
Right. Or how about this? What you're going to do is we want you to testify against your client who potentially committed a crime.
Right.
Because they learned about something and then disclosed it.
It's appalling.
Yeah, it's appalling because we have obligations. All sides have obligations. And one of the obligations we have, and we are sworn to this, is that we have an obligation to our clients. There are certain privileges that simply exist. And we have an obligation. In fact, we have ethical obligations that if he had disclosed that, he could potentially face ramifications from the Board of Professional Responsibility in Georgia for disclosing something that was actually protected. So he could lose his right
his
to
bar card.
Law.
His bar card was on the line to answer that question.
So what you get now, imagine what it is to be a lawyer. You spend God knows how long trying to become one. You spend the next 25 years trying to get good at it. And what you have is a judge telling you, I'm going to put you in jail unless you violate your ethical obligations and potentially lose your license because I want it. Yeah. And it's not actually about that. It was actually about the ex parte communications you, judge, had with the prosecutor and a witness to try to force them to testify and then not disclosing it. That is actually as appalling, or in some ways more. But I come back on this issue. I think about what it is that we do as a whole. And I think about why, when you look at what's going on and dare I get too broad, when you look at what's going on in America, why people are starting to doubt sort of the roots of who we are as a people. One of the reasons is because we have attacks on the system itself that say it's fundamentally unfair. This was all a setup, and you shouldn't believe the police, you shouldn't believe the FBI, you shouldn't believe the Justice Department, you shouldn't believe your local cops, or you shouldn't believe the other side, or you shouldn't believe the defense attorneys because they're all liars. And the problem is that what we have to have is people who sort of ride above the fray. The problem is, in my opinion, this judge actually didn't do that. His job, and that's a really difficult job, is to say there are certain obligations that we all have, and they're different, each person in the room. We have to respect those while at the same time making sure we're fulfilling our obligations of due process. And that was the failure.
Well said. Last point on this, and quickly, because I want to move on to the other cases, but do you think that all of this has caused enough trouble that we're either looking like we're running off a cliff towards a mistrial or perhaps even reversible error after the longest criminal case in Georgia history, and now it might get turned over on appeal based upon all these shenanigans?
Yes. The answer is yes. I think it'll be overturned. In fact, these cases never should have been brought. If you go into Georgia, and I spent a lot of time in Atlanta, one of the things is I'm talking to the people in the room. I'm talking to the people involved. And the DA shouldn't have brought these. Basically, when you look at what was going on, what they had already completed, how many people had already flipped in this case, how many people have already pled guilty, you look at what you're trying to do. When you start having to prosecute cases because sort of this broad RICO conspiracy argument, it can be very, very difficult. And you can see how they're turning themselves inside out in order to get this prosecution. There has been so many problems. You add this to it as well. This is just another example. The defense, and this is one of the reasons the judge, I think, has been so frustrated, is the defense has rightly asked for a mistrial dozens of times, one of the defense attorneys, and most of those times they had grounds. Yeah. They had legitimate reasons, and they don't want to do this again because they never should have done it in the first place. So I think what may very well happen is if they can get convictions, and that's even doubtful to me in some ways, I could see this go up to the Court of Appeals, get dumped, and then everybody's going to say, okay, let's just act like it never happened. So imagine that. Here we are.
Yeah, what an embarrassment. God.
Yep.
All right. Well, that case is going to continue to go on, and I don't think that's the end of this issue that we've heard. We will continue to follow it, but just some real remarkable developments this week. Let's move on to Lawrenceville, Georgia, where a former police officer accused of a teenager's kidnapping and murder has been convicted on 4 of 5 charges after only a week of trial proceedings. Jurors convicted 23-year-old Miles Bryant on charges of malice murder, felony murder, kidnapping, and concealing the death of another, along with the charge of filing a false criminal report in the murder of 16-year-old Susana Morales, who was kidnapped while walking home from a friend's house before her naked body was dumped in a wooded area. While the pair didn't know one another, prosecutors argue Bryant was emboldened in the crime of opportunity by his connection to law enforcement, believing that he would get away with the crime despite his service weapon being found near Morales' body, which Bryant had reported stolen. Following Bryant's arrest, he told a cellmate who testified at trial that there was no way he could be charged since there was no blood or semen connecting Bryant to the case. However, prosecutors presented a wealth of strong circumstantial evidence connecting Bryant to the crime, including cell phone data, placing him at the scene where he dumped Morales' body, and internet searches featuring charming epithets such as, "How long does it take a body to decompose?" and "How are you ID'd by dental records?" The former officer also used law enforcement databases to track where his license plate was picked up along the route to where Morales' body was dumped. Bryant opted not to testify in the trial, and the jury swiftly convicted him of multiple counts, yet declined to convict him on one charge of attempt to commit rape. Regardless, Bryant is still sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. taking an opportunity to speak before sentencing, Bryant was brief, but stated that he wanted to apologize to everybody and the victim's family. Okay. The part that is most chilling to me about this, Jack, is what kind of a sociopath are we dealing with that is a police officer who essentially is committing a murder, a thrill murder, just to see if they can get away with it based upon some sort of warped view that their policing skills will help them.
Yeah, it's a petrifying circumstance. But what really grabs my attention, and I know you and I talked a bit about this earlier, is just how many former police officers we're starting to see. I mean, start thinking about this right now. Are those who are involved in forensics or true crime, if you want to call it that? There's a certain obsession. We think about the Koberger case where we had somebody working on a PhD. He's facing 4 counts of murder right now. And we think about, who are these people? I mean, one of the things that I know departments have tried to do across the country, and they do these with the feds, and I did this when I was with the feds too, is we all went through a lot of psychological evaluations, because the fear is, what kind of a person wants to lord over others? What kind of a person wants to have a sidearm and can walk around and say, you're going to do what I tell you to do because I tell you to do it? Because if you think about that, you think, what kind of a person does that? I'm going to make a huge leap right now. But think of it like this. Sometimes, and I deal with a lot of murder cases, but crim sex cases and things like those. Sometimes you'll get people who will say, how could that Boy Scout leader be the one who was doing this to these children? And then the next question becomes, who becomes a Boy Scout leader? Now, I'm not suggesting that all Boy Scout leaders are child molesters. I'm not. But what I am saying is, if you're somebody who has a predilection, somebody who is interested in being close to children and actually has nefarious reasons for doing it, wouldn't you maybe think about becoming a Boy Scout leader? See, That's what I'm talking about. So you start thinking about, who becomes a cop? Why do they become a cop? What are their underlying motivations? And it really starts to say a lot, potentially, about those who do the things that they do. I can take you back. There was that situation with the Border Patrol officer down in Texas, I think it was, who killed multiple prostitutes. And he was a Border Patrol agent, and he was doing the exact same thing, where he was actually trying to manipulate evidence. But one of the big mistakes that I've seen, and I've seen these from a lot of former police officers, and frankly, a lot of people charged with crime sometimes, is that they have a myopic view of it. They miss the big picture. So what you get is, there was no blood, there was no semen, there were no fingerprints. So therefore, they can't ID me, they can't get me, if you will. But what they forget about is the obvious. First of all, your sidearm. Okay, that's a gimme. But let's go broader than that. You start dealing with things like cell phone triangulation. You have cell towers that are actually placed, and your phone, when you have one like this, it pings off of those towers, where you can place your somebody within sometimes even a couple of meters of a space. And if you know where a dead body is, all of a sudden you can say, not only do we know when somebody was there, but we know where they were there, or at least where their cell phone was there. But we have the same thing with cars now too, because they have smart technology. So you can, with some cars, you can actually tell when a car door opens. You know what time it opens. You can tell when they're they're going forward, or whether they're in reverse. You can tell all sorts of things. Speed, you can determine for a whole series of reasons. This is all the kinds of evidence that are used against somebody who's charged with a crime. But there's one last piece that this former officer forgot. For those who may not have seen this investigation, there was one of the lead investigators in this case who did the interrogation of him. If you wanted to learn how you do a good interrogation, go watch that video. Yeah. What she does is, she has a partner in the room, but if I could just lay this out, what she does is, she has this guy essentially sitting in a seat against a wall, and you watch her lean in on him. Yeah. And then she starts to pivot, and she slides one of her knees between his. Yeah. And then she actually slides her other knee between his and leans into him. And you watch him start to pull back, but he's stuck. And then she starts to sort of open her knees up just enough that it's making him all of a sudden do this. And then she would just very lightly, with a lot of empathy, needle and work her way into him. Good police work is about so much more than saying, do I have a fingerprint? Do I have semen? Do I have blood? Sometimes all you need is a really, really good cop. And this cop, she was really, really good.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen the video too, and I agree with you. I feel uncomfortable for him watching it.
I know, me too.
And you're watching it from, above and to the side, and still you do feel this sense of she's definitely imposing on his space, but it's such a delicate way in which she's doing it that it's not overboard so that he just shuts down, but it's enough to throw him off balance that he is completely disarmed and unable to answer the questions in any kind of a convincing way, and starts to stumble over his answers and backtrack and not have a good answer for anything. And you're right. You are absolutely right to point out that it is a huge mistake to think that if you've got forensics, DNA, fingerprints, what have you, that's enough. That many, many times the most convincing evidence can come down to that interview and what comes out of that. And if they get zilch out of that, that's a problem. But if they start to get admissions, obviously, or even bad admissions, I was somewhere else that they provably were not, or, providing just a bad timeline can be hugely powerful evidence at trial. So yeah, I agree with you. That was pretty fascinating. Just to go back to your point too, about this kind of weird dynamic that we do see, and we see this. There's no denying it. You see studies done on serial killers, and they all, not all, but a lot of them seem to have this weird fascination with law enforcement. They may have applied to be a police officer at some point, or they were just kind of obsessed with chatting with police officers. And you said this, and I'm going to take the opportunity to say it. I am very good friends with a lot of police officers. There are family members of mine who are police officers. The vast majority of people go into that line of work because it's a higher calling and they want to do what's right and protect their community. But there is a fringe and very nightmarish group of people who go into that for the power and for the ability to carry around a weapon and tell people what to do. And those types of personalities might also even step into the world of sociopath and wanting to kill someone like we see here. I mean, I'm blown away by the idea that this is not a passion killing. This is not a domestic violence thing gone wrong. This is simply, there's a random person. I bet you I could get away with it. Like we saw, it sounds like we're starting to see in Kohberger as well. Random people. Let's see if I can get away with murder. It's absolutely terrifying.
To establish that you're actually smarter than they are, and that you start thinking about this in sort of a scientific, almost disinterested way. Yeah. You hide that.
It's an experiment. You're conducting a social experiment.
Exactly. You're wrapping this around your sadism and your psychopathy. And we have seen that. But, again, one additional piece on this. I'm still stuck with this interrogator who did this, and I say this because one of the things that I did is I was doing interrogations for the CIA, and so my experience and education comes from a bunch of different directions. So I watch it maybe a little differently. Here's one little other piece about it that I like. She's a woman. I love that, and I love it because some people think that cops are supposed to look a certain way, or that people are supposed to be a certain kind of person in order to do this. And what this highlights is that that's actually the mistake. If you brought in somebody who looked like me or somebody who looked like you, I'm guessing it wouldn't have gone as well. Yeah. And it's possible that it wouldn't have. And what you get is that people come with all sorts of preconceived notions. Hence, when we walk in front of juries constantly, we're always dealing with this, right? We're doing it all the time. But when you think about police officers, it's the same. Imagine you bring in the guy who's 6'7". He comes in yelling and screaming, and he's got a cowboy hat on and a big cigar. You're going to start getting assumptions on what that means. You bring in a woman sometimes, you might get a much different assumption. Sometimes it's because people diminish them, ignore them, assume that they're not a threat. I'll tell you what, some of the best lawyers I know, some of the best judges I know, some of the best doctors I know, some of the best everything that I know are everything that you think they're not supposed to be. Yeah. If that's a person of color, if that's a woman, if that's a trans person, I mean this. Wherever you come from, I don't care who you are, if you're not what people assume and they start to say, oh, that person's not a threat, that's the person you should be afraid of. Yeah. And I'm petrified of that investigator. If I ever see her in person, I'm going to run the other way. I mean, I'll tell her she's awesome. I'll do it from a long way off.
No, Jack, you ask for your lawyer. If you've learned nothing, you ask for your lawyer.
That's exactly. Yeah. Boy, how many times have we said that? It's like, for God's sake, I have one thing for you to remember. Just one. Yes, I have nothing to say without my lawyer present. Exactly. Where's my lawyer? That's it. You get nothing from me.
Yeah. Well put, though. Very well put. That certainly was a strength that she used, was probably the disarming nature of this guy and his likely misogynistic preconceptions of who she would be, and she certainly turned that around on him.
By the way, she also did one other thing. We're a brotherhood, man. We're cops, right? We're just cops. We understand, she probably threatened you. She probably tried to offer you drugs. She starts going down this path, and you watch her start to slide back and forth, trying to find his weak spot. She's looking for that soft underbelly. And I'm watching her. I'm like, damn, look at you. Look at you.
It was a masterclass. It's definitely well worth watching. Let's move on to our final case here out of Portland, Oregon, where a father who drugged his daughter's friends with laced smoothies at a sleepover will serve jail time after pleading guilty to multiple felony counts. Michael Maiden was sentenced to 2 years in prison on 3 felony counts of causing another person to ingest a controlled substance after 3 of his daughter's friends, who were all 12 at the time, tested positive for benzodiazepines, a depressant drug typically prescribed for anxiety and insomnia. In court, Maiden was remorseful, claiming my whole life is destroyed, while maintaining that he only served the girls the laced beverages to get them to bed by 11 p.m. I was overly fixated on them going to bed. Yes, that is true, Maiden admitted to the court during his sentencing hearing. The drugging incident was only discovered when one of the victims noticed a strange taste in the mango smoothie and refused to take the full dose, despite Maiden allegedly pressuring the girl to drink more. She became concerned when her friends, turned unresponsive, and claims that Maiden came to the basement where the girls were sleeping multiple times, allegedly to see how incapacitated they were. The victim was able to contact a family member who came to get the girls, who were so sedated they were immediately taken to a local hospital. Maiden will also be subject to 3 years of supervision upon his release. Jack, this one is so weird and disturbing to me because, first of all, it's absolutely out of control appalling to ever put anything into someone else's body without their permission. Now you're dealing with minors, you're dealing with young women. They've been entrusted to your safety in this sleepover, and it's just beyond all comprehension, the abuse taking place here. That being said, there's no allegations that he had nefarious intent beyond all of that. So it's like, how do you square all of this? What is your reaction to this?
Those are all great descriptions, and I agree with every single one of them. It's just so icky.
Yeah.
There's something about this that is so icky to me. The idea that you're essentially roofing a bunch of little kids, and the idea that this is your obligation is to protect them. He's in a position of authority. And that's why those children are there. And he says they're supposed to be asleep by 11 and they weren't. So my response is to roofie them. Yeah. Wait, let me get this right. that that level of breaking of trust is a horrifying thing. The idea that you think you can just do this. Now I understand there's no evidence that he sexually assaulted anybody. And he says and he claims that there was no motivation to do that. And yet at the same time, the sort of the breaking of that obligation is so extreme that you actually physically assault, and this is an assault. You physically assault these girls is a horrifying thing. And I think actually the court was appropriate. I think it was worth saying it doesn't matter what your motive is. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter whether you intended to sexually assault. The assault took place when you put them in the drinks and you handed them to them. It wasn't about what happens after the fact. That would have ramped it up even further, certainly. But the assault took place as soon as you made that decision and started mixing those things and walked down the stairs and said, here, drink more.
Yeah. Yeah, the more I think about it, the more I worked up I get, because I'm trying to think if I'm in the position of the parent of one of those girls, I would be beyond livid with, how dare you? And then you start to think this is not some over-the-counter, magnesium pill or something like that he gave to them. This is a prescription medication. They could have had adverse reactions. I mean, this could have turned all sorts of sideways quickly, but the unmitigated gall to say, I just want to make sure everybody gets a good night's rest. So I'm going to take this upon myself to do it. Just, if you're a parent, it absolutely puts you through the roof to think about. That all being said, courts are oftentimes confronted, and prosecutors are oftentimes confronted with these situations where it's like, the guy's got no criminal history. He's obviously remorseful. This looks like an anomaly in his life. How do you handle this? Do you think they handled it the right way?
Here's part of the problem. Part of the problem is that it depends on how I want to look at it, right? I mean, I'm a father of 4. My kids are all adults now, all 4 girls. And I hear this story and I'm imagining if I'm one of those fathers, right? And I'm thinking to myself, you're lucky the cops got you first.
Exactly.
Right? Okay, so there's that part where you're like, so you're going to do some time? Well, you're lucky you get to do some time. There's that piece of me. Then there's the defense side of this saying, understand that when you look at the number of cases that are negotiated, that are settled, right, that resolve, and when you think big picture, the number of people who go to prison, and you have to decide which ones, and you start thinking, okay, what did they do? But what is their history? What's the likelihood of them repeating those offenses? What is the possibility of ongoing damage to those victims? All of those are questions you're trying to balance to come up with the right answer, because we could always talk about being tough on crime. If we want to be tough on crime, we're going to raise our taxes by multiple folds, because the number of people you put in prison is a small percentage of the number of people who are convicted of crimes. Mm-hmm. And if we're going to start getting really tough on these people, and we're going to go do that, then we've got to be prepared for it, because it isn't cheap. And so you have to ask yourself, is this one of those guys that rise to the level? My real problem with him was how much worse this potentially could have been.
Yeah.
And if what you're saying is, so he's claiming he never sexually assaulted or never intended to, is that because the one was still awake?
Yeah.
The one who didn't quite drink all the drink? Does that change it for me? I think I keep coming back to this multiple, purposeful, intentional, willful assault, and not just a no-dose that I got over at the local Target. I had to go behind the counter and get a doctor to give me something with a whole list of prescriptions that say how I use it. And then I'm going to go in and I get to play doctor myself.
Yeah.
If I'm the judge on this one, I start adding it up. He might be one of my guys that I put in for a little while.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. Well, if there isn't enough nightmare fuel out there for parents, here you go.
Right. You're like, you're not going over to anybody's house.
Exactly. Jack, as always, it was a pleasure. Thank you again for stepping in on short notice. Thank you for coming on this week. Where can people find out more about you?
You can go to jackricelaw.com. That's the website, and I'm online, and you can probably find me. I'm based in St. Paul, but I'm around the country and sometimes around the world teaching or working. And we do what we do, man. This is what we do.
Exactly. Well, thank you again, sir. It was good to see you. I am your host, Josh Ritter. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Joshua Ritter ESQ. And if you want to hear my thoughts and coverage on even more true crime cases, please check out my new YouTube channel, Courtroom Confidential. And of course, you can find our Sidebar episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And we want to hear from you. If you've got questions or comments you'd like us to address, tweet us your questions with the hashtag TCN Sidebar. And thank you for joining us at the True Crime News Sidebar.